Hello, my name is Karina Graham. In the Society of Creative Anachronism, my name is Lady Simone Delacroix. I'm from Stegby and from the Kingdom of Lockhart. This video was for a class that I was going to teach at the Known World Heraldic Scribal Symposium, but as we all know, was cancelled due to COVID, and they are putting it into e-form, which is great. The video goes with documentation, which go into more details about the different aspects of Persian Illumination and the differences between it and European Illumination, the materials and other things. At the bottom of that, there's a written step-by-step of what we're going to go through in this with photos. And I've also added in that a printable copy of this line drawing for the class, and I've also added a photocopy of my completed work to use as a colour map. Also in this I've added another printable worksheet to practice the degrade technique used in the Persian Illumination. These are some hand-drawn enlarged flowers of the design of the flowers used in the design. Also in that printout there's this visual mini step-by-step of the technique that I've just painted to try to explain it more. Okay. I've also added some of my experiments in making period ink, shell gold and some verdigris. There are several differences between Persian and European illumination. One was their preferred use of paper and how they decorated it. They used dyeing and marbling and gold sprinkling. They felt that white paper was damaging to the eyes. They also did a high degree of burnishing the paper. The second use was their preferred use of gold as a paint, what we call shell gold, rather than the gold leaf that Europeans preferred. They also added other metals into their shell gold, such as silver. Silver-rich gold changes the colour to a cooler gold, like what we call champagne gold, or they'd add copper, which gave a warmer gold, like rose gold. Now, the third difference is the use of actually burnishing the pigments, which I don't think was used at all in European illumination. They tried to get a slightly glossy, opaque layer of paint. And fourth was the use of mixing the pigments to achieve different colours, unlike the European preference for using pure colours. So the Persian palette was quite limited. There were two genres of Persian painting, Surikgari and Naqashi. Surikgari is classed as animate objects such as humans and animals. It was also called figural or figurative art. Whereas Naqashi, also called decoral or non-figurative art, was limited to inanimate objects, floral and vegetal patterns, which were closely copied after 7 base designs. Naqashi is what we'll be focusing on today. This is a copy of a Naqashi non-figurative design that I painted using homemade shell gold, period pigments and my own version of Morocco paper. The next step is putting the design onto the prepared paper. This would have been done with a charred twig called a tamarind or a pen and brush with dilute ink. There has been some speculation that leftover pigment was used due to some signals given out by Raman spectroscopy tests while analysing the pigments. Tracing was also used by Persian illuminators. They would copy a master design using thin paper or translucent gazelle skin. I used modern tracing paper. I find this brand really good. After the design was traced, they would use a small awl to poke holes around the design. Then they'd use a bag full of fine charcoal dust to pounce through the holes, the charcoal, onto the paper. Then it was necessary to ink over the charcoal design so the charcoal didn't rub off. I used, for this process, modern transfer paper. This is fantastic. This graphite, you put it down, put your picture over and draw it. Probably already know that, but I thought I'd add it anyway. Okay. The last part of this video is me doing a voiceover of when I painted this design. You know, saying, pointing out different bits that I, pieces that while I was doing it. While I'm doing the voiceover, I mention a few little bits, such as an alternative to using the crow quill was these micron pigment liners. They are artist quality, come in different sizes and colours, and are light fast. So if you don't want to use a crow quill, these are very good to use. You also see me using some glassine paper. Forgive me if you already know this stuff, but I'm just putting it out there. This is the glassine, if you haven't used it, it's glassine paper. It looks like baking paper. Maybe you could use baking paper instead. I haven't tried it, but I really recommend this stuff. It stops smudging. The other thing I mentioned to protect your work is the use of this wooden bridge. You just put your hand on it and it keeps your hand off the work. I really love it. I bought it from John Neal Booksellers online, which is a great scribe store. They even give a 5% SEA discount. If you probably already know that, but I'm putting it out there. So enjoy the rest, and hopefully I'll see you on the Saturday of the Known World Scribal Symposium for any question, and that for a 30-minute question and answer that I'll be doing for anything I didn't make clear. Thank you. The next step is to ink the design. This is necessary to stop the original design rubbing off, which would have normally been done in charcoal. Here I'm using a crow quill and handmade walnut ink. I've added a link to my experiments with making this in the documentation. You could also use a pigment liner, a modern pigment liner, to do the same thing. Under my hand I've placed just some paper toweling. Later on you'll see that I replace that with glassine paper, which I prefer. Next step is to paint the shell gold. I'm using Fine-Tech Arabic gold paint instead, purely because shell gold is really expensive. Any artist quality gold gouache can be used. Shell gold was made by crushing gold leaf into fine particles. Different things can be used to accomplish this, such as honey, sugar, and gum arabic. Sometimes salt was added to help the process. When it's fine enough, it's then rinsed repeatedly to remove the additives. Then it's mixed with the binding medium of choice. This could be glare, animal glues, or gum arabic, which was the most common. I have experimented with making shell gold and have added a link in the documents if you'd like to have a look at that. The gold would then have been burnished, which they often did, some parts burnished, some parts not. And the burnishing, when they burnished, they called that cooking the gold. This being not real shell gold, it's not necessary to burnish it. If you notice here, the centre part where I've painted inside and around, oh that's very blurry, around the gold where I've drawn, I suspect that that could possibly be done over the top of the gold, but I find this way easier. Here I'm adding Winsor & Newton alizarin crimson. I wanted to point out the consistency used. It's very fluid and like the consistency of very runny melted ice cream or runny cream. I actually push, I'm not using the paintbrush on the paper, I'm more pushing a puddle of colour around. This is quite easy to do on the Morocco paper since it's been burnished and it's very slippery. By consistency, it should be very, very fluid but not watery. That's really important. So it's not like a watercolour wash. If your paint's too thick, it'll fall off, and if it's too thin, it will not look nice and it will wick out of the design. So again, the consistency is quite important. If you're using period pigments, I find that each colour has its own consistency, so it's just trial and error. Here I'm mixing up the 3 different tones of the colours that I'll be using for the flowers for the degrade technique. You can't see the top one, unfortunately, so just different from light, darker. Just play around with until you get the colours that you like with enough difference in them. I'm using my brush to mix that, which is a very good way of wrecking your paintbrushes, so just use an old one. You can also see here just how fluid that paint is. Here's where I'm putting the lightest shade down for the base colours of the degrade technique. You can do light to dark or dark to light.
I've seen both done on different period manuscripts. Some have both versions in the one manuscript. I just chose light to dark because I felt like I lay in all the lightest tones for the different colours flowers before I move on. I cheated a little and did the red one first, as you can see, but that's not what I wrote in my documentation, so pretend you didn't. Next step is to add the ornamental lines. This is done not only for the visual effect, but to keep the pigment colours separate. Medieval artists had to be very careful in colour placement and which colours they mix together. For example, orpiment will turn lead white grey. This happens even if they're only painted side by side. I used a crow quill and handmade iron gall ink for this, which I've added ink to my making it in the documentation. This can be done with a fine brush and fluid black paint or a modern artist quality pigment liner. I call this the ugly stage. I promise once all the other paint's on, it comes together. It does not look as bad as this when it's finished. The next step is the degrade technique for the flowers. I've added an enlarged blank worksheet of the flowers used in this pattern to practice on. Basically, the technique is adding the next colour. You've added the lightest one, then you add the next darker hue colour and paint it in the shape of the flower, but leaving the millimetre or two of the so the original colour couldn't show through. You let that dry and then you add the third colour, which is a darker colour again. Again, leaving that gap so you see the underneath colours. And the final technique after that would be to add the pure colour as a highlight. As a side note, the Persian painters burnished their coloured pigments to achieve the depth and hue that they wanted. They would put down a colour, burnish it till it's shiny, and then paint over again until they achieved the colour and the opaqueness that they wanted. This seems to be quite unique to the Persian and Islamic artists. It's not necessary to try to burnish modern pigments. Here I'm adding the pure colour, as I mentioned before, to finish off the degrade technique. I really like this section because I think it really brings it all together. This is my favourite part, that putting the background colour. I think it really pulls it all together. I'm using Winsor & Newton Ultramarine Blue here. The most common colour for the background in Persian manuscripts was a nice blue. Normally this was lapis lazuli in its pure form, or as the refined colour that Europeans called ultramarine from over the sea. The Persians wouldn't have called it that because Afghanistan was very, very close. But I haven't found what they actually called it. Although this would seem a very tedious way of painting, it would seem more logical to put down the background colour and paint the design elements on top of it. There was actually a good reason for doing it this way, due to the properties of the pigments themselves. There are difficulties in applying colours on top of a field of lapis, which is particularly noticeable when using gold, as it sinks right into the lapis and can't be burnished. So the artist has to use their own skills to do the decorative design, to paint around the decorative design. Again, the paint is really very fluid. The wooden thing that I'm laying my hand on is a U-shaped bridge, or upside down U. It keeps your hand about an inch above the work, which makes this stage a lot easier. The next step is to paint the red outline colour around the design, the shape of the design. I'm using alizarin crimson because I used it in the middle and I thought it would bring the whole design together. But the more common colours for this was green and blue. The final step is to add the gold decorative needlepoint design lines called ties, T-I-G-H-S. They are fine, sharp design lines extending outward from the artwork. There are many different types of these ties. I liken them to doodles. I used a fine brush with an ultramarine blue and I added the small red dots with a crow quill and some handmade Brazil ink. You can use just a paintbrush with paint or with ink, or all of it with a crow quill, or even get some coloured pigment liners, and they can work quite well. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope it enlightened you or helped you or amused you in some way. I will be available for a 30-minute question and answer at the event on the Saturday at 12:30. Really hope to see you there, and I'd love to see your finished artwork, so I can be contacted on Facebook and email. The information is in the documentation. Thank you.